Hello, and welcome to Charted, an astrology podcast. My name's James, and today we are going to talk about Mercury Retrograde. So, I wanted to do this episode for two reasons. Number one, right, today is June 29th. That means today is the day that Mercury is stationing retrograde. So we're now entering a Mercury retrograde period. Figured it's a good day to discuss that generally. My general observation from watching, astrology content over time on YouTube, TikTok, not so much, but I see a lot of pop astrologers who look at Mercury retrograde as a period of chaos, right? Where things, oh no, the sky is falling. It's Mercury retrograde. Everything bad suddenly starts to happen, yada, 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 or what have you, right? And I don't think that's a very good approach to understanding Mercury retrograde, where everything's suddenly going to not work out properly or anything like that. Is that to say Mercury retrograde periods are, perfectly fine and kind of go swimmingly? No, not really. But it's not the end of the world either, right? And so I wanted to kind of clarify, what is Mercury retrograde about? What does it mean as far as transits go? And then also, what does it mean if you have it in your birth chart? Because Mercury retrograde is pretty common. It happens 3 times a year for about 3 weeks each time. This one actually is a tiny bit longer. It's like 3.5 weeks. But normally it's about 3 weeks. So it's pretty common for people to have Mercury retrograde in their birth chart. So I wanted to discuss that as well. The second reason is because this summer has some pretty uncomfortable astrology, at least collectively. I think on a personal level, it might not be so bad. And in many cases, actually really good. But on a collective level, it's going to be a tad uncomfortable. And it kind of kicks off with this Mercury retrograde period, because Mercury is going to be retrograde for most of July, where we get some rather interesting astrology. And so I wanted to kind of lay the groundwork for what Mercury retrograde is first, before in a follow-up episode, I will discuss the astrology of the summer so that we can kind of get a better sense for what's actually happening collectively. So that being said, let's dive in. So first question we have to ask is, what is a retrograde? And what is it specifically to Mercury, right, once we understand it? So a retrograde is when a planet appears to move backwards in the sky. It, from a practical standpoint, is not actually moving backwards, right? It's not like it just stops in its orbit around the sun and suddenly says, nope, reverse course. I'm moving backwards now. That doesn't make any sense. Just logically breaks a bunch of rules of physics. So that's not what actually happens. But the thing is astrology is based on perspective. We're here on the Earth. The Earth is orbiting the sun. We're watching the things in space also orbit the sun, irrelevant to us in many ways, with the exception of the moon. And so their orbits and our orbit combine in a lot of interesting geometry. That means things don't always move visually how we would expect them to move in actuality, right? It's a perspective thing. And so what we see then is when planets hit particular parts of their orbit, or more specifically, when the Earth hits particular parts of its orbit relative to the other planets, they appear to move backwards. An easy way to visualize this would be if you stood and watched a merry-go-round, carousel. Or if you don't have one easily like in view, right, you could ask a friend to walk in a circle and note the direction of that person or that thing moving in a circle. Note its right and left direction, and only its right and left direction. Don't worry about depth. Don't worry about how far or close it is. And what you will notice is when it's on the far right of the circle, it will appear to be not moving, at least in a right-left directional sense. And then it will finish its rounding of the circle and begin to move, say left, for example, across to the other side of the circle, where it will again appear to not really move to either the right or the left, as it's kind of moving towards you. and then again begin to move back towards the right as it rounds the circle back to where it began. And so what you get then is this perspective of something moving right and left and right and left. And that's essentially what we're seeing in the sky, especially with Mercury and Venus, which stay pretty close to the sun astrologically. So then a Mercury retrograde is where we're watching Mercury in a particular part of its orbit as it's essentially moving, rounding that circle around the sun or in front of the sun. And so it appears from our perspective on Earth to move backwards for a little bit before then moving back forwards. Now, logistically, in an astrology chart, there's a couple things we want to note with this retrograde. Number one, what does it mean astrologically when something's moving backwards? It's the first thing we want to understand. Number two, we want to understand the shadow period and the retrograde period specifically, and the second shadow period. I don't know if that's what it's called, but that's what I'm going to call it today at least. So you have a shadow period, you have the actual retrograde, and then you have the second shadow period. What does that mean? Well, when a planet retrogrades, it's going to have a point where what we call it stationing retrograde. That's the point where it stops moving forwards and officially begins to move backwards. That's where it stations retrograde. That's what's happening today, June 29th, 2026. Mercury is stationing retrograde. Did so earlier this morning, at least where I live. So it's now officially retrograde as I record this. For the next several days, it's going to move slowly backwards through the zodiac, back through ground it's already covered, until it gets to a certain point where it will again station, stop, and turn direct, and begin moving forward again. So that period then, or that set of degrees between the two stations, is what we'd call the shadow period, right? At least as it's moving forward before retrograding and moving forward again after retrograding. So, to make it even more clear, this particular Mercury retrograde happens in the sign of Cancer. Mercury entered its shadow period on June 12th, and when it passed 16 degrees of Cancer. From 16 degrees of Cancer until from June 12th to June 29th, it was moving direct until it got to 26 degrees of Cancer and stationed retrograde. From June 29th until July 23rd, it will move retrograde back over those same degrees, from 26 of Cancer back to 16 of Cancer, where it will again station direct and then begin to move forward and back over the degrees it had passed already twice by that point. So what that means then is we get a process of passing over the same degrees 3 times. You have the initial oomph, the backtracking, and then the secondary oomph, right? The final oomph. Now, when a planet is moving backwards, what does that mean? Well, it means the planet is retracing its steps. It's going over ground it has already covered. And when we do that in our own personal life, what does that typically equate to? It means we're reassessing something. We're looking over something for mistakes, for issues, or sometimes something came up and now we're trying to, got to redo this, got to rethink this, got to re-communicate this, right? I have to something, right? Renegotiate. Whatever it is. And each planet is going to deal with different things. Obviously, Venus, more with values, relationships. Jupiter with belief systems. But in the terms of Mercury then, what is Mercury doing when it's retrograding? It's reassessing thinking, reassessing communication, reassessing writing, reassessing translations, learning. Right? Mercury is about translating the outer world into our minds and translating our minds into the outer world. So it's how we interface with the world generally and with other people. So that deals with our learning skills, our thinking skills, our communication skills, our tactile skills. So anything in that sphere is going to possibly need to be reassessed during the retrograde. So what typically will happen then is you'll get the shadow period come along, you'll be living your life, you'll kind of do your normal stuff, and there will be something that happens. Sometimes it's multiple things, sometimes it's just one big event, sometimes it's very minor things that then has to take a look back, take the secondary effect during the retrograde, right? Where it comes back up, that same issue, that same theme, that same communication comes back up in some way where it needs to be readdressed or retouched on. And then in the final pass, that'll be kind of the completion. Sometimes the completion is a completion, right? It's the finished project, right? The final draft, right? The resolving of an argument. Or sometimes it's just laying bare, okay, now we're at war again, right? Now we're in combat again. Now we're in conflict again. Now we've ended the relationship. It could be a lot of different things. It depends on where Cancer is in your chart, where Mercury is in your chart, and where the Mercury retrograde is happening. And so Mercury retrograde isn't something to necessarily freak out about because, and any retrograde for that matter, isn't something to freak out about. It's a period of reassessment, right? Rethinking something, redoing something, and specifically rethinking and recommunicating. Communication issues are very common during a Mercury retrograde. I would say especially during water sign Mercury retrogrades and air sign, because with water you have a lot of emotion involved, right? It's a watery sign, so there tends to be an emotional component to the reassessments. And air signs is obviously very communicative, very social. So with Mercury retrograde periods, there's often going to be things that need to be reassessed, right? Conversations that need to be had a second time, a third time, right? Issues that will come up, kind of bubble up and need readdressment. Sometimes it's just reflecting on things. You don't even have to have the second conversation. You're just reflecting on what happened already and learning how to move forward. Does it mean that the world kind of goes haywire? On a personal level, no, because it's dependent on where the Mercury retrograde is in your chart. And I think this is an issue I see with a lot of astrology content online, broadly speaking, is because it's general. We're just talking about the transits generally. But how things happen generally do not always apply to a person specifically. For example, this Mercury retrograde, as I had mentioned, is from 16 degrees Cancer to 26 degrees Cancer. If you have no planets and no angles in those degrees or near those degrees, I would even say from about 12 to the end of the sign. If all of your planets are at the early part of a sign or in fixed signs, you don't have any cardinal signs, you're probably not going to feel much from this Mercury retrograde. It's not to say you won't, but it's not likely. It's very dependent on your own personal chart and where your placements are. But if you do have placements that are within those degrees, and especially near the station points, that is 16 degrees of Cancer and 26 degrees of Cancer, and I would say the cardinal signs generally, Aries, Libra, Capricorn, that's when you will tend to feel the retrograde more distinctly. The station direct point and the station retrograde point are going to act as kind of like exclamation marks. It's like a big stamp of, here we go, change, right? Change is needed. And whenever there's big moments of change, it tends to be impactful. It tends to be a shift. It tends to be jarring at times. And so you certainly, if you have placements near 16 or 20 degrees of a cardinal sign, you may feel this one. It might be a little emotional. But the reality is, because at least we look at the retrograde stationing chart, the moon is in Capricorn, it's a full moon. Make sure that the emotions don't overcome, right? Don't let the reaction be purely emotional. Take that time to, okay, how can I look at this like a Capricorn would, objectively, right? With the practical mind, as opposed to purely emotional. Even if there is emotions involved and whatever thing comes up for you, whatever communication, learning, right, writing, thinking, thoughts that comes up that needs to be readdressed. Collectively, All right, to give an example, and I'm going to cover this in the next video for sure, of kind of how this may play out is if we look at what's going on in the world right now, right, one of the kind of big things, at least here in the U.S., is the U.S. has been in a war, not war, lunacy with Iran, where the Straits of Hormuz have been closed down. There's been issues, peace talks, peace deals, non-peace deals, broken peace deals. It's been a whole convoluted mess. But on June 12th, right, Mercury entered its shadow period. And then that following few days, you had Pakistan put together the finalized Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU. And then within a few days after that, I think it was June 17th, I don't have my notes in front of me, but the U.S. and Iran signed the deal, or the MOU. It's not really a peace deal. It's just a, hey, we're going to discuss things. But because that happened during the shadow period, what we can expect then is during the retrograde period, which starts today, as I record this, June 29th, we're probably going to see that MOU come undone a bit and need to be rethought, need to be reassessed, right? Which means there's going to be friction involved, especially if we look at the other astrology, which is why I wanted to do a second video, which means that in 3 weeks' time, right, or more than 3 weeks possibly, is when we're actually going to see a resolution to said deal as it kind of comes undone and needs to be reassessed. That would be an easy way for this to play out collectively, or I don't want to say easy way, but one of the ways in which it's probably going to play out collectively. And so on an individual level, you would look for things kind of similar to that. Sometimes it's big stuff, a big fight with a partner, big fight with a friend, right? A work deadline, a work project. And sometimes it's small stuff, little conversations that kind of all happen. And then over the next couple of weeks, was I wrong to think that? Was I wrong to say that? Or maybe something that comes up that you learn and so on and so on. But I do want to say, as far as transits goes, Mercury retrograde is a good period to rethink things and reassess things. If you're being proactive, it's a great time to really think through what you're doing, really reassess how you're acting in the world, how you're thinking about things in the world. Also, a good time to, right, learn new skills. A good time to sit back and say, hey, this thing I've been learning, if you've been learning a new skill, practicing something new, to sit back and say, can I learn this a different way? Do it a different way, right? And then to kind of make those plans. Now, if you have Mercury in your birth chart, or Mercury retrograde in your birth chart, what does it mean? Well, Mercury retrograde, or any planet retrograde in a birth chart, means it's looking backwards. It's looking towards where it came from, and it's wanting to move that way instead of forwards. So for people with Mercury retrograde, then, it means their Mercury, their natal Mercury, is in a position where it wants to be more reflective. It wants to reassess things. So retrograde planets oftentimes can be seen as a little slower. It's not a bad thing per se. Certain times it can be really good. But with Mercury specifically, you get somebody whose thinking process may be a little more introspective, or a little more thoughtful, a little more oriented towards inward reflection rather than outward communication. It can often indicate people who are shy. Again, that's dependent on the rest of the chart. It can sometimes also indicate learning disabilities, things of that nature. Why? Because there's a desire to do things in a different way, right? Not necessarily do it in a way that's straightforward. But either way, Mercury retrograde periods actually tend to be very beneficial on net and tend to actually be very smooth periods for people who have it natally, because it highlights something. It's a recurrence, right, of something you have in your natal chart. And so people with Mercury retrograde in their natal charts tend to actually excel during retrograde periods, especially if they're paying attention to them, right? They can utilize them very well because, hey, I have this, right? This is, I'm used to this. Great, fantastic. Let's move forward. But that said, Mercury retrograde in the natal chart, again, isn't necessarily bad, but it is more introspective. It is more reflective. It is more as its natural predisposition to assess first. Let me rethink this. Can be an overthinker in that sense if it's not careful. But it does take more time to learn, to think, to communicate than a typical direct Mercury would. So that's pretty much everything for this Mercury retrograde period. Again, the dates, right? Today, June 29th. This video, or episode, I should say, is coming out June 30th. So it'll be one day past the retrograde station. But that means for the rest of June and into July, until July 23rd is going to be the retrograde period. And from July 3rd onward, we will then have the direct station and back to moving forward, resolving things. So most of July is going to feel, if it ends up being a more uncomfortable retrograde period for you, this early part of July, most of July is going to be a little more, let's think things through. Let's make sure we're talking things through in a correct way and not letting the mistakes happen. So that's everything for this episode. I hope you enjoyed. I hope this is clarifying. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. You can always email me or write a comment if things aren't clear. I'm hoping things are clear. But yeah, so if you're looking for a reading, you can also reach me at my email, jdastrology, or james@jdastrology.com, or just go to my website, jdastrology.com. And again, thank you for listening. Hope you have a lovely, lovely day. And I hope the Mercury retrograde is one that can be very fruitful for you, one that can be very beneficial in terms of reassessing and rethinking what we have going on in our life. Thanks for listening. Bye.